Okay, so you've joined us for LaRouche PAC's strategic update of September 5th with Mike Stager. I just note we're meeting at an extraordinary time in history. There's no American now alive, as I think Mike is going to discuss, who's seen a movement remotely resembling the MAGA movement of Donald Trump. You'd have to go back to the days of the Civil War and before the Civil War to the movement against slavery and to preserve the Union under Abraham Lincoln to find anything remotely comparable to the MAGA movement we're experiencing today. So, as back then, over 150 years ago, Americans today have a rendezvous with history. And with that, let me hand it over to Mike Stager.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Well, thanks everyone for attending tonight. As Tony said, it's just kind of a remarkable situation we see ourselves in. And it's worth just, it was in the email announcing the discussion tonight, but it's worth just recounting that Donna Brazile, the former head of the DNC, she was the one who replaced Debbie Wasserman Schultz after the whole Bernie Sanders scandal in 2016, gave the questions to Hillary Clinton for the Trump debates, and was a longtime kind of associate or supporter of Al Gore going back to 2000. She on ABC said, she's an African-American, Black woman, American, political activist, hardcore Democrat operative. And she said that she hasn't seen anything like this in her lifetime, where what she said is if it doesn't kill you, it only makes you stronger. So, and she referenced, which of course means a lot, says a lot to the crowd she talks with, that Trump raised $10 million off a mugshot. So their knees are shaking because the territory they control is collapsing. And a main area has been and this was even clear in Trump's second election, was that especially working class Hispanic men, working class Black men, inner city populations, but a lot of men who realize that this feminine culture of just sit back and consume, and if you get so it gets just become poor enough where the government pays for everything, and the men should just kind of work cheap jobs and deal with a culture saturated with drugs and constant cheap immigration coming in, that these policies of destruction, that the Democratic Party has taken advantage and exploited certain layers of the population for what they consider guaranteed votes, many of whom don't vote, but they do. Like the dead, they end up voting. And that's a lot of what this is all about. Trump is making, and this movement is making, major inroads into these working class neighborhoods that are not the upper class affluent suburbs of the Obama agenda, kind of the Obama fascist movement of affluent suburbs, but is really a working class, broad scale, big tent movement that is, as Tony said, unlike anything anyone has ever seen before, far more overwhelming and powerful than the civil rights movement. And is that really a question of the principle of the nation itself, as slavery expressed itself? And for those who understood either now or then, yes, the slavery was a moral question, but morality is not separate from a nation's well-being economically, culturally, scientifically. It's not just a moral question that it's wrong. It actually holds back the economic power of the human mind that can be unleashed with an appropriate policy. The same thing today is with globalization. And this, of course, is what Trump has unleashed a fight against. And really, that's the subject of our discussion. So just to situate kind of that aspect of what we're engaged in, and in some sense, this is what our movement, the LaRouche movement, has been discussing for decades. This kind of moment, as we've discussed on some of our Saturday classes, a mass strike, as it was described in the late 19th century. But certain poetic minds identified that you reach a moment where it's a universal characteristic that it becomes contagious, infectious. It broadens and broadens its scope because its underlying characteristic is something universal to the human mind. And it's not something that can be mechanically shaped or determined. It can't be mechanically provoked or determined. It is something that arises naturally as a condition of the human mind to respond to these kinds of crises in human history. It's like a survival mechanism built in to the non-mechanical mind. And at certain points, when the very existence of our species is threatened, or critical institutions like our constitutional republic are threatened, not because it'll be defined that way in people's minds, but that quality of human mind emerges. And that's something that our enemy can never control, and they really don't even understand, and they certainly can't speak to. This is what LaRouche always looked to speak to. It's what Trump is speaking to in the hearts and minds of the American people in his own way, but he's speaking to it. So let's get into some of the things that are developing in this context. As we said 2 weeks ago, we had to launch a major initiative to shut down these legal attacks on Trump, and that had to come from the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives. Well, we've seen dramatic action in that regard. Now, it may not be sufficient yet, but you see it moving in multiple directions. So Jim Jordan is now doing a direct investigation of Fani Willis to look at coordination with the DOJ. This became overt when they launched the set of grand jury indictments before the grand jury had even met, and they posted it on their website prematurely and then took it down and then re-released it. I mean, the fact that the DOJ, Jack Smith, was screaming at somebody in Atlanta, Fani Willis, to get this thing done was somewhat obvious. You also have the fact that a top lieutenant in the Jack Smith cabal running this persecution was also meeting in the White House with the Biden team. So there's direct and overt political coordination with Biden. So Jim Jordan is investigating this entire operation. It's got to have teeth. You've got to kick hard. Not tapping at doors isn't going to work here. You've got to really push the issue. But that is a major step forward. You also have, and Tony may remember the name, but you have a congressman from Georgia on the House Appropriations Committee who has, we mentioned this last week, who has said he's going to put a rider onto one of the appropriations bills that would shut down any funding for any special prosecutors and any district like Fulton County or Manhattan, which is prosecuting a major presidential candidate. So that would shut down the special prosecutor's office. It would strip all funding for that county, district, or special prosecutor in the DOJ. You've also got other operations. There is calls and possible hearings when Congress gets back in. That'll be a week from today, hearings investigating Biden. But as we've said and continue to emphasize, going after the doddering old fool Biden will not be sufficient. In some cases, it may, you can't say for certain, almost nothing works mechanically the way you think it might in this period. The old political playbook fails. That means you don't know exactly how things will play out. But simply going after doddering Biden for the corruption that everyone that works in Washington, going back to the Bushes, the Clintons, the Obamas, everyone has milked the system. I mean, what Devin Archer was doing, setting up a private equity fund to milk, so all these foreign countries and companies would just give them millions and millions of dollars to buy out people in Washington, regulators, congressmen, what have you. That's just how the system has worked. It's disgusting. So simply going after Biden for that, as corrupt as he is, will not shut down the fascist operation centered in the DOJ under Merrick Garland, under Lisa Monaco, who's the deputy attorney general and a top Obama witch, and Jack Smith and that network. But there's motion. It's also worth noting McCarthy. So that means that we've got to continue to escalate the calls in, the pressure on people, the pressure on members of Congress. Go after the DOJ too. They can do it all. It's time they did something, right? McCarthy's also making a trip. Maybe he's already there in Maui. And the level of malfeasance, incompetence, disregard that took place in the response to the fires. One, the fires were foreseeable. There have been fires in 2019 and 2020. This probably killed over 1,000 people. A majority, maybe up to 1,500 people, just incinerated in their cars or in their homes. A majority of which could have been children who were sent home from school. There was no response. They were foreseeable. They were not prepared. They had not made clear what the response would be if a fire broke out, even though that was clearly something that could happen. Should we set the alarm? Shouldn't we? What's pathway out? Send kids home? Don't send kids home? Everything like the pandemic was just like fake it till you effing make it. And what happens when you do that at critical junctures, like with the bailouts in 2008, like in the response to 9/11, is that a lot of people die. A horrendous number of people are maimed, injured, or killed because you do not have a coordinated plan. You do not have the ability to act on foresight. So it's just a gross level of incompetence and criminality that, of course, mainstream media has ignored. McCarthy is going to be making a visit to that. There's been we have one of the largest naval bases in the world in Hawaii. We have the Marine Corps. We have huge logistic capabilities. None of that, as far as on-the-ground reports go that I've seen, and I've looked at a number of them, there is nothing. The military has not been mobilized at all. It's hard to imagine. And yet, of course, a lot of the oligarchs like the Obamas, Oprah, Zuckerbucks, these types also have major economic interests in Maui. And that just, it gets at the core of the system and what change has to happen, a commitment to the American people. Okay, so that situates some of what we said 2 weeks ago that is in motion. And hopefully you've played a part in that. You've been out organizing. We've been hitting the UAW. Auto plants, there's going to be 2 go on strike. I think it's going to be General Motors and Stellantis, or at least approaching a strike condition. They've filed with the various federal bureaus. I think the DOJ. So hopefully you've been out organizing as well. You've hit your congressman, you've called them, you've let them know, you've raised the pressure and temperature in this circumstance. But we also said last week that as in addition to doing that, we have to escalate. Now, the point we made last week was that you've got to go at this central banking cabal. That this is where the real criminal operation lies. And that to turn the economy, to really turn the system, to break the backs of this globalist oligarchical system, the central banking system has to be broken. And over the last year and a half, we've been mobilizing around a project called Project Prometheus. To boil it down to a few points, it would mean building 1,000 nuclear power plants over the course of Trump's next 4 years, and mobilizing a national banking system and credit and industry to build that process. Maybe 100 the first year, 200, 300, and then 400 the fourth. Initiate them, get them moving. And the reason we've proposed that is because at core, to remobilize what we might call the arsenal of democracy, that great arsenal of manufacturing and production that places like Detroit or Los Angeles, and other locations around the country, embodied to make the miracle of pulling one out of the Depression, but mobilizing for World War II. And as Franklin Roosevelt saw it, that the plant capacity, the industrial capacity we would build out for the war would then be applied and even be insufficient for post-war reconstruction. But all of that hinged upon the power supply, that we had rapidly increased our nation's electrical grid, our distribution system to farms and small towns all over the country, but we'd also massively increased our power electrical output. And in doing so, you had the ability to then build up that arsenal of democracy. This was perhaps embodied most in Franklin Roosevelt's Four Corners program: the Niagara Falls, Tennessee Valley, the Hoover Dam, and the Grand Coulee Dam in the Northwest. I say all that because Trump came out with his own escalation just a few days ago, about 4 days ago. It was part of his Agenda 47. It's on his Truth. After I'm done speaking, I'll share the link to his Truth account. It was a private video on Rumble, so he wanted people to view it on Truth, from what I could tell. But that was a few days ago, just as a footnote. But his proposal was to say, we've got to make the United States the manufacturing and industrial center of the world, from semiconductors to steel plants to auto industry to every kind of appliance production, manufacturing, plant line. Everything's going to, every company in the world is going to want to have production facilities here. And as we noted last week, as a study done by a couple of kind of younger leftists, the only way to get nations out of poverty, the only successful way ever, whether it was South Korea after the Korean War, Japan after World War II, or the United States after Civil War, was a rapid investment and advancement in manufacturing capability, because you employ large numbers of people who might be doing gig work or subsistence farming, whatever the times might provide. And you quickly move them into something where they're becoming they're making a far greater contribution to society, and it's a large section of your population, or potentially so. That's the essence of a manufacturing-driven economy. And it's the miracle of why China has taken so many people out of poverty. Trump called for building hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of power plants, all of it, and to use that to make the energy in the United States the most affordable, cheapest, most reliable, long-term in the world. There was an old saying during the 1960s, not that old, I guess, but there was a saying in the fusion community that if we go fusion, energy would be practically free. Well, that's the direction Trump is going. And to do that, you've got to build not just fusion plants. We can't do that yet. You can't even build hundreds and hundreds of nuclear power plants. You would need to build coal plants, natural gas plants, whatever you can build to get the power supply going, more hydroelectric, but to get the power supply needed to begin to manufacture on a broad scale the nuclear power plants and then fusion plants required. And Trump is saying, let's build it, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants. And in addition, rebuild the electrical grid, fortify it. That would be a minimum of 3,000 to even 5,000 heavy voltage transformers. It'd be rebuilding the industrial base of the United States. These heavy transformers, which are like substations, the way you might have seen them in the power grid. We can't produce the components in the United States. We'd get it from South Korea, Germany, or Mexico, or China. It would take 12 to 18 months. These are national security questions, but they're also just the ability to manufacture what's needed from, as Tony Papert once put it, from the steel caps on the steel sewage caps on the street to the most advanced electronic and manufacturing equipment in the world. We should produce everything, be capable, from bed sheets to the most, space fancy fabrics for astronauts we can imagine. We should produce it all. So Trump called for this, and this is exactly the kind of wartime strategic thinking, because it's not tactical. It's not obsessed over just the legal attacks. Yes, we're going to fight the lawfare. But as we can see, the lawfare is also just not working. It's blowing up in their faces. Trump is raising more money. He's consolidating a Republican primary. These candidates should get out of the way. I don't even even someone like Vivek, who will say something positive for Trump. At this point, shut up, endorse Trump, and get in the war. Stop promoting whatever you're promoting on your own agenda. This is an existential question for the nation. The rest of them are mostly just cowards. This Friday, Trump will likely receive the first endorsement of a major Republican governor, Kristi Noem of South Dakota. We should make sure that if you're in a state where there's a Republican governor, Republican senators, congressmen, we should also be putting pressure on them to shut down the primary by endorsing Trump. Public endorsements of Trump from top Republican officials will close the door on any of these other idiots from continuing to run the clown show that they're running. Because the sooner Trump can take this message of making the United States the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, by first and foremost building the power system we need to rebuild that arsenal of democracy. He takes that message into places like Phoenix, Tucson, Vegas, and Reno, the two of the southwestern states that are really swing states, even into Albuquerque, and really goes at it. He's going to really shift the Hispanic vote, just like he did on the south, the border areas of Texas. These places are inundated with the open border insanity. He's going to go in there and say, we're going to create real wages, real jobs, real production, the real American dream. We're going to do it with sovereignty, and we're going to do it on a real economic foundation. And of course, Trump's proposal just raises the obvious specter that even the economists recognized, that Trump is going to challenge the independence of the Fed. He would have to. You can't have a Federal Reserve controlling monetary policy and do what he's describing. You need a real credit function, like what FDR set up, a Reconstruction Finance Corporation, some vehicle, a national bank vehicle to build this. So it's in there. He's not laid it all out. He's not said all of this, but it's implicit. Our job is to make it explicit, to build up the support for such initiatives so that Trump can build the team he needs now to execute on day one this kind of full scope agenda. And if he goes to the Southwest states, he'll also be going to Atlanta, Philly, Detroit, Milwaukee, those areas where they controlled some of the critical swing states, and open this up. This is huge. As I mentioned, in Detroit, the UAW could be on strike at two of the big three motor companies. But it's going to be true in all of these areas. The inner city parts of our country, like the cities I just referenced, are ridden with crime, drugs, total destruction. Almost every criminal out there, I would say 95% of them, that's probably a decent estimate. 95% of every person engaged in a criminal behavior is directly connected to drug use. Think of the parallels between shutting down the drug trade, shutting down this drug culture, opening up manufacturing, what that would do to crime, safety, livability, and the ability to invest into these areas and to rebuild the cities of our country as we also build new cities. That's Trump's message. That was his commitment in 2016 when his campaign was not controlled by the Republican Party or Washington, D.C. He went into Detroit. He was in Atlanta multiple times during his presidency, speaking to Black preachers. The potential to open this country up and to build the kind of process is really there. So as much as all of the legal attacks may get some of us down, or at least a little anxious and concerned, all of us should recognize that the real intent behind these legal attacks is psychological warfare to undermine this growing political base. They know they're not going to touch the hardcore Trump supporters, but they also know that many of the hardcore Trump supporters have a difficult time engaging in the kind of broad political coalition that Trump is actually out to build, and that was really the hallmark of LaRouche's 8 presidential campaigns. That's why we play such an important role. The people in Michigan are somewhat shocked by our ability to go and engage with these UAW workers, but it's not that hard. Drop your assumptions, talk about things that we all share in common, and give people a sense that we can win. Because that's what the propaganda machine, that's what the cable news and mainstream media, That's what they want to control, is that sense of real hope, of real optimism, of real victory that people are craving for. And they know to win a war, to get that victory, you are going to have to kick some ass and be tough. But they have to know that we can win first, and what winning really looks like. So Trump escalated in this direction is key. So what we're going to do is, I emphasized it tonight, but we're also going to continue to emphasize this specific energy proposal. The proposal to build what is, in essence, approximately 500 new power plants. It would practically be a 10% increase of baseload power supply in the United States. You've got a lot of wind and solar, but it's unreliable. Baseload, real power plant capability, hydro, gas, coal, and so on, is what Trump's talking about, and nuclear, with an emphasis on getting as much nuclear as possible. There's a lot of implications of that. There's a lot of inputs that are required. So we'll address this more in some of these Monday sessions as part of shaping up the sense of what the American presidency is really about. Because Trump is embodying it with this project. This is really the modern science of economy at core. It challenges all of the textbooks. It challenges all of the quackademics in universities. It challenges all the economic theories out there. You're going to drive with rebuilding an industrial base like a wartime kind of mobilization, similar to what we saw in the 1930s and 40s. And by looking back at that, we can be even more precise with what really worked, what was really effective, and how do we drive it and accelerate it as much as possible. But I want to touch on one thing before we take discussion tonight. One of the things that's missed in this kind of, even those who will understand the importance of reviving this American system of tariffs, trade protection, national banking, credit, manufacturing, industry, building cities, or people that really recognize the critical role of energy supply, even nuclear power or fusion power, is that it can remain in a practical domain. And there's something that's deeper within this political crisis that we should be conscious of, that we're addressing through this kind of economic agenda. Because it's completely overlooked by even the people like I mentioned who support, even aggressively support, and are organizing around some of these critical policies. But it's a crisis everyone on this call is likely already aware of. And it's a crisis that plagues a large portion of the population, especially 35 and under, that are not yet clear what this political movement is. And what I'm referencing is a crisis of a meaning to one's life. What's the purpose? Why am I here? There are people who are attempting to address this, well-intended, helpful people who are speaking to this crisis. It plagues, to a large extent, young men because of the kind of emphasis that young men are, and masculinity is a problem. It plagues them because the roles of jobs in industrial production, in that kind of responsibility where good incomes are earned to be able to buy a home and raise a family, men have lost that sense. But it affects the population generally, men and women alike. And it can't be simply addressed from the standpoint of building a family, of staying strong and healthy, not getting fat and lazy and just playing video games all night on caffeine drinks and fire hot Cheetos. Or some of the practical advice out there, if you've seen this stuff, is like, get up every day and make your bed. And then, start from there. These are perhaps useful things for people that are really at the bottom of, should they just keep on living? Understandably, these are important steps to take. But for a lot of people who are making their beds, working a job, maybe even raising a family or starting to, are still plagued by, what are we doing? This is not just in the United States. The rampant drug use, which is connected to this, because if you don't know what you're doing, then drinking, partying, hedonistic lifestyle, the drugs, all of that just comes with it because there's a lack of mission and purpose. People don't end up having that from a religious outlook. They don't go to church. It's not a religious community that fortifies that, or a general cultural worldview. You live a good life, you live a good Christian life, you go to heaven. That's all been lost. You're not going to reconstruct it by those kinds of religious outlooks. The religions have a great role to play. But that simple kind of outlook that people might still educate their children on in Sunday school, by the time you're in your 30s, the world has challenged some of these conceptions. It has to become more mature, more advanced. And it's, like I said, it's not just the United States. The demographic crisis, the fact that we're not reproducing enough young people, will be met and addressed by, of course, having the productive jobs, having a growth perspective, having a sense of building new cities and new industries. But there has to be something there culturally driving it. The same thing is found in Japan or South Korea, all over Europe, even China. None of these places have a birth rate capable of replacing their population. All of the major industrially advanced countries in the world are facing a massive demographic crisis. Why? Well, it's to a large extent, I think, what I'm addressing now. Because for a lot of young people, the grind to get to a state of physical comfort to where you're not going to starve, doesn't seem that difficult. In some places of the world, it remains, there still may be starvation. But even when you look at where real famines occur, it's usually malfeasance, politically, culturally, and a lack of basic infrastructure. It's not an absence of food. But of course, in advanced cultures and societies today, there's an abundance of comforts. Even the pandemic was far, as we all know, was far, far, far less of a crisis than they painted it to be. They exploited it as a crisis. They saw it as an advantage to exploit, to get Trump out of office, to run roughshod over small businesses all over the world, to implement police states for social control. But the actual pandemic was not that bad. So the loss of life, the ability to take life for granted, because so many people are lost. I had an appendectomy recently. I mean, 150 years ago, an obsolete organ gets infected, you're dead. Today, you're out of the hospital in like 24 to 48 hours. We all know these things. We all know that there's a greater comfort. And it's not just the United States, it's not just Western culture. And the reason I raise this is because it's something that Lyndon LaRouche profoundly addressed. Because he recognized that this kind of existential crisis, almost clinically an existential one, would manifest. That it was manifesting and it would only get deeper and deeper. And that pushing the liberal forms of hedonism, of free market, free trade, greed is good. Feed your physical desires. Basically feed the sociopaths and psychopaths. That if you indulge in that kind of culture and promote it, you're going to end up with a greater and greater sense of, why am I even here? What are we contributing to? And LaRouche recognized that we have to give there can be some scientific metric of how do we measure the success of human civilization, and that we can recognize from a scientific and cultural standpoint that the bounding principle of the universe itself is what human society is doing. That what determines the condition of the universe as a whole is the singular nature of mankind's advancement or lack of. That if mankind is collapsing, the direction of the universe itself is receding. is regressing. Because there's nothing more powerful in the universe than the human mind. That's a profound cultural statement. It's the kind of optimism Trump operates from. He may not put it in those terms, but it's that same kind of optimism or sense of worldview that the propaganda machine is constantly looking to attack. But LaRouche also recognized we can fortify this in the same economic policies we've been discussing and that Trump put forward. That by advancing our ability to produce new forms of power supply, to transform the infrastructure capabilities of the planet, to create the conditions by which greater scientific discovery can be had by a broader portion of the human population, so that more scientific discovery can be had, is really the most important metric of the ability for humanity to advance, for future generations to be given the necessary inputs, physically and even culturally, the work, responsibility, and devotion required to sustain that, to not fall prey to the worlds of sin, of hedonism, of self-indulgence. As a culture, not just as a person, but as a culture and as a society, and advance industrially and scientifically through these economic policies. Now you say, okay, well, that's great. Well, because that makes sense. But it wasn't just that you could measure human society that way. Even if you looked at biological life on our planet, it had a similar course of activity. So if you looked at the evolutionary process of living species on the planet, from a Russian scientist's perspective, his name was Vernadsky, he recognized that the transformations happening through human infrastructure, through electricity and new power production, coal, nuclear, and so on, that reflected the same level of changes that were happening within biological species. And that the only thing more powerful than the biological activity over billions of years was the activity of the human species over just thousands of years. I say all that, it may sound more abstract and philosophical, but that's the point. That if we're going to be able to reach a sense of meaning, I want people to at least have access to the same thing LaRouche provided, which was that the policies we're driving for that can rebuild American manufacturing, make us a strong country, end this globalist tyranny of financiers, drug pushers, and parasites, is the very same kinds of economic and cultural policies that will rebuild a sense of meaning, even for people that don't participate, that don't get it. It's going to rapidly increase their own sense of value and their own sense of purpose and meaning and potential to contribute. That we're going to be able to bring forward the best of our population through this kind of commitment. So I wanted to make that point because I think that in some sense, we're going to develop the economic policies more in depth over the coming weeks, both in written form on our website. So if you get that, please share it with all of your network. Share the emails, ask people to sign up. But at the same time, we're going to develop it over the coming weeks for these discussions as well. But in my mind, that deeper sense of what we're really looking to provide and enrich the population is no different than what Plato and Socrates reached with their discussion of the immortality of the human soul, or what the Christian apostles were able to demonstrate in terms of that worldview, that the economic policies, this commitment to grow and develop rapidly, creates the same kind of cultural opportunity to restore a sense of real meaning and purpose into individual lives. And for the kind of crisis, especially that young people face, but it's not only young people or the veterans who got ground up in these wars, to restore a sense of real meaning and purpose in their lives is absolutely the kind of thing I want to fight for and make sure that they have access to. And not just the American people, but people all over the world have a similar capability of participating in that sense of what it means to be human. And I think that's really what ultra MAGA represents and why this enemy the satanic enemy, recognizes they see this kind of threat of a cultural shift in the MAGA movement and in the policies Trump is fighting for. I don't want that just to be implicit. I think we should be overt and explicit with it. So that's my shtick tonight. Tony, I'm going to just hand it back to you.
Terrific.
I guess we've got a couple of hands raised and we'll see what people are thinking.